The man who revolutionized American literature died on a Sunday morning in Idaho, surrounded by the mountains he loved, holding a shotgun. Ernest Hemingway's death at 61 wasn't the ending anyone expected for someone who'd survived wars, plane crashes, and enough physical trauma to kill most people twice over. But here's what's strange about that July morning in 1961. The myth had already consumed the man years before. You know Hemingway, even if you've never read him. The terse sentences, the stoic heroes, the obsession with courage under pressure. What you probably don't know is how a doctor's son from suburban Chicago became that myth, or what it cost him to maintain it. Oak Park, Illinois, in 1899, wasn't where literary revolutionaries came from. It was wealthy, conservative, and suffocatingly proper. When Ernest Miller Hemingway arrived on July 21st, his father announced the birth by playing a cornet fanfare from the family's wraparound porch. The neighbours probably found it charming. Ernest would spend most of his life trying to get as far from that porch as possible. The house, at 339 North Oak Park Avenue, had a distinction worth noting. First home in Oak Park with electricity. His maternal grandfather, Ernest Hall, owned it, and the newborn's parents, Dr. Clarence and Grace Hemingway, lived there with him. Grace was an operatic singer who made money teaching voice lessons. She had ambitions beyond Oak Park, dreams of concert halls and recognition. She'd give her son many things, but the ability to be content with a quiet life wasn't one of them. Dr. Clarence Hemingway, known as Dr. Ed, practiced medicine and taught his children something far more valuable than anything Oak Park could offer: how to survive in the wilderness. Every summer the family travelled to Windermere, their cottage on Walloon Lake near Petoskey, Michigan. Those months in the North Woods became Ernest's real education. At Walloon Lake, a boy learned to hunt, fish, camp, and read the forest like a book. Dr. Ed was exacting about it. You didn't just shoot a deer, you tracked it properly, killed it cleanly, dressed it correctly. There were rules, rituals, a code. Young Ernest absorbed all of it. The precision, the attention to what was real versus what was posturing. The understanding that nature didn't care about your feelings or your family's social standing. This split between Oak Park propriety and Michigan wilderness created a tension Hemingway never resolved. His mother wanted culture and refinement. His father wanted competence and self-reliance. Ernest got both, and the contradiction would drive much of what he later wrote. 6 children eventually filled that Oak Park house. Marceline came first in 1898, then Ernest, followed by Ursula, Madeline, Carol and Lester. Grace dressed Ernest and Marceline identically as small children, blurring gender lines in ways that made Ernest deeply uncomfortable. Whether this actually damaged him, or he simply convinced himself it did later, it became part of his personal mythology. What's certain is that by the time Ernest entered Oak Park and River Forest High School in 1913, he was already constructing a self separate from what his family wanted. He competed in boxing, track, water polo and football, not because he was naturally gifted, but because he needed to prove something. To whom? Maybe to himself. He performed in the school orchestra with Marceline for 2 years, his mother's influence, but his real passion emerged elsewhere, writing for the Trapeze, the school newspaper. Here was something he could control completely. Words on a page didn't require his mother's approval or his father's instruction. They were his. His grades in English were good. His stories for Tabula, the school's literary magazine, showed promise. But nothing suggested greatness. Plenty of high school kids write decent prose and then disappear into normal lives. What made Ernest different wasn't talent yet, it was hunger. After graduation in 1917, Dr. Hemingway faced a decision. His son clearly had no interest in college. Boys Ernest's age were volunteering for the army, shipping off to fight in Europe. America had entered the Great War, and the pressure to enlist was enormous. But Dr. Ed didn't push his son toward the military. Instead, he made a phone call to the Kansas City Star. Could they use a cub reporter? At 17, Ernest Hemingway started working in a newspaper office in Kansas City. The Star had a style guide, and it would shape everything he later wrote. Use short sentences. Use vigorous English. Be positive, not negative. Eliminate every superfluous word. These weren't suggestions, they were commandments, and Hemingway learned them like Dr. Ed had taught him to field dress a deer. Years later, Hemingway would say the Star taught him to write simple sentences. That's underselling it. The Star taught him that clarity wasn't just preferable to ornament, it was morally superior. Every word that didn't carry weight was a lie. This philosophy would make him famous and eventually trap him. Kansas City gave him something else, distance from Oak Park. He rented a room, earned his own money, moved through the city's rougher neighborhoods, covering crime and accidents. He was building a new identity, one that had nothing to do with music lessons or proper behavior. But the war wouldn't let him stay detached forever. By early 1918, the pressure to get into the fight became unbearable, not from his father, from himself. His friends were going, history was happening, and Ernest Hemingway, at 18, couldn't bear the thought of missing it. The US Army rejected him because of his vision. Poor eyesight, the same curse that would plague him his entire life, but the Red Cross had an ambulance corps, and they didn't require perfect vision. In May 1918, Hemingway sailed for Europe. He arrived in Paris first, saw it briefly, then moved to Milan. The Italian front needed drivers. Ernest wanted to be where the action was. He got his wish faster than he expected. On the night of July 8th, 1918, Hemingway was at a forward observation post along the Piave Delta, handing out chocolate and cigarettes to Italian soldiers. He was being useful, playing a small part in something vast. Then the Austrian mortar shell hit. The explosion knocked him unconscious and buried him in the earth. When he came to, his legs were shredded. Fragments had entered his right foot and knee. His thighs, scalp and hand were struck. Later, he'd count the pieces of shrapnel, 237. Whether that number was exact or enhanced, it became part of the story. What happened next became the defining moment of Hemingway's mythology. Despite his wounds, he carried an injured Italian soldier to safety. Machine gun fire hit him again during the rescue. For this, the Italian government gave him the Silver Medal of Valor. He was one of the first Americans to receive it. The wound itself was terrible enough, but what came after mattered more to his development as a writer. 6 months in a Milan hospital. Pain, surgery, the slow, grinding boredom of recovery, and Agnes von Kurowski. Agnes was a Red Cross nurse, 26 years old, to Ernest's 18. She was sophisticated, experienced, everything Oak Park wasn't. Ernest fell completely. She was kind to him, maybe led him on, maybe genuinely cared. The details don't matter as much as what Ernest made of them later. They talked about marrying after the war. She wrote him letters. He believed it was real. Then after he returned to the United States, in 1919, she sent a different kind of letter. She'd met someone else, an Italian officer. She was sorry. The rejection devastated him in ways that seemed disproportionate, until you understand what Agnes represented. She was the first thing he'd wanted that he couldn't obtain through will or effort. The war he'd survived, the wounds he'd endured, but love operated on different rules, and those rules made no sense to him. This heartbreak would resurface in a farewell to arms more than a decade later. The entire novel, in some ways, was Ernest rewriting the ending. In fiction, he could control what happened. Catherine could love Frederick, absolutely. She could die, yes, but she couldn't choose someone else. Death was acceptable. Rejection wasn't. Back in Oak Park in 1919, Ernest was a wreck. He'd gone to war a boy and returned something else, but he didn't know what. The wounds still hurt. The nightmares came regularly. He'd wake up convinced he was back in the trench, waiting for the next shell. His parents didn't understand. How could they? Dr. Ed had never been to war. Grace wanted him to do something productive, get a job, contribute. But Ernest couldn't settle. He spent months recovering, fishing in Michigan, trying to figure out what came next. He wrote stories mostly, drafts he'd later destroy or rework. They weren't good yet, but he was learning something crucial. Writing about what hurt was the only way to make it bearable. Not better, just bearable. In 1920, he moved to Chicago and took a job at the Toronto Star Weekly. He was back in journalism, but restless. The city felt small. The work felt limiting. He needed something bigger, somewhere he could become whoever he was supposed to be. That's when he met Hadley Richardson. She was 8 years older, red-haired, from St. Louis. She had a small trust fund, enough to live modestly. More importantly, she believed in him. Not in what he'd done, but in what he might do. That belief mattered more than her money. They married in September 1921. By December, they were sailing for Paris. Paris in the 1920s was where you went if you were young, ambitious, and American, and couldn't stand America anymore. The exchange rate made it cheap. The culture made it electric. Everyone who mattered or who would matter was there. Ernest and Hadley moved into a small walk-up at 74 Rue du Cardinal Lemoine in the Latin Quarter. The apartment was tiny, poorly heated, perfect. Ernest rented a separate room nearby for writing. He had a wife who believed in him, a city that didn't care about Oak Park, and enough money to survive while he figured out if he actually had talent. What he didn't have yet was a style, a voice, a way of putting words together that was distinctly his. The journalism had taught him clarity, but clarity alone doesn't make literature. He needed something else, and he found it through an unlikely mentor. Gertrude Stein lived at 27 Rue de Fleurus with her partner Alice B. Toklas. Her apartment was filled with paintings by Picasso, Matisse, Cézanne. On Saturday evenings, she held salons where writers and artists gathered to talk, argue and drink. Hemingway started attending. Stein recognized something in him immediately. Raw talent, yes, but more than that, hunger. He wanted to be great and he was willing to work. She took him seriously when almost no one else did. She read his early drafts and told him what was wrong with them. She introduced him to the painters whose work was revolutionizing how people saw the world. Most importantly, she gave him a phrase that would define his generation. "You are all a lost generation," she said, probably quoting her garage mechanic. Hemingway absorbed it, turned it over in his mind, and eventually used it as the epigraph for "The Sun Also Rises," the lost generation. It captured something essential about the people who'd survived the war and couldn't figure out how to live afterward. They were disoriented, wandering, directionless. The old values had died in the trenches and the new ones hadn't arrived yet. Paris became Hemingway's real university. He met F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, Ezra Pound, and dozens of others whose names have faded but who were all part of the same desperate project, making new art for a world that had destroyed itself. He learned from the painters as much as the writers. Cézanne's approach to landscape taught him something about simplification and structure. You didn't paint every leaf. You found the essential shapes. The same applied to prose. By 1923, Hadley was pregnant. Their son, John Hadley Nicanor, nicknamed Bumby, was born that October. Fatherhood should have settled Ernest, given him responsibility and purpose. Instead, it intensified his drive. He had a family to support now. He couldn't just be a promising young writer forever. He'd been working on a novel, a book about Americans in Paris and Spain, people drifting through expatriate life, drinking too much, sleeping together, and trying to feel something that wasn't disappointment. The Sun Also Rises would eventually become that novel, but it wasn't ready yet. He needed more life first. In the summer of 1923, Ernest decided they needed a change. Paris was getting crowded with people he knew, and he wanted distance from the cafes and the conversations that went nowhere. He'd heard about the bullfighting in Spain, Pamplona specifically. The running of the bulls, the festival of San Fermin. Hadley was game. They packed light and took the train south. What Ernest saw in Pamplona changed him. Not immediately, not in some dramatic flash of understanding, but slowly, the way a photograph develops in a dark room. The bulls, the matadors, the ritual violence performed with precision and grace. Here was something authentic in a world that had become fake. The bullfight wasn't metaphor, it was death, actual death, happening in front of thousands of people who'd paid to watch. Ernest studied the toreros the way he'd once studied his father's surgical technique. Economy of movement, no wasted motion. The great matadors didn't flail around the ring. They stood still and let the bull come to them, moving only what needed to move, controlling the animal through understanding rather than force. It was a lesson in style, though he didn't articulate it that way yet. They returned to Paris changed. Ernest had found his subject, or part of it, the code. How to live when the old rules don't apply anymore. How to face death without flinching or lying about what you're feeling. The bullfighters knew. They did it every afternoon, and the ones who survived did it with grace. But here's what most people miss about that trip. It wasn't just the bulls. It was watching Hadley in Spain, seeing her respond to the intensity of it, realizing that she understood what moved him. For a moment, they were perfectly aligned. That wouldn't last. Back in Paris, Ernest started writing seriously. Not journalism, not sketches, but fiction that mattered. He worked on short stories, refining his approach, cutting everything that wasn't essential. If a sentence didn't advance the story or reveal character, it went. No decoration, no showing off, just the thing itself presented clearly. Gertrude Stein read his work and approved mostly. She told him he had talent but needed to develop it, needed to stop imitating other writers and find his own voice. Ernest bristled at criticism but absorbed it anyway. He was learning to separate his ego from his work, to kill his darlings before anyone else could. Then in December 1923, disaster. Hadley was travelling to meet Ernest in Switzerland, where he'd gone to cover a conference. She packed a suitcase with his manuscripts, stories, drafts, carbon copies, everything he'd been working on for months. At the Gare de Lyon, someone stole the suitcase. The work was gone. Years of effort vanished. Ernest's reaction was volcanic. He raged, despaired, blamed Hadley even though it wasn't her fault. The loss was catastrophic, or seemed to be. Only a few pieces survived, things that were already in the mail to editors, a couple of stories he'd left in drawers, everything else gone. Looking back, some biographers suggest the theft might have been the best thing that could have happened. The lost work was probably apprentice stuff, derivative, not yet Hemingway. Being forced to start over meant he could begin from a more advanced position, having learned from mistakes he no longer had to publish. But at the time, it felt like the end of everything. He rebuilt, started writing new stories. Out of Season, The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, Indian Camp. These were different. Leaner. He was finding the rhythm, the voice that would make him famous. Short sentences, simple words, emotional weight carried through what was left unsaid rather than what was explained. In 1924, he met F. Scott Fitzgerald. Scott was already famous, already drinking too much, already married to Zelda. The two writers formed a complicated friendship, competitive, affectionate, destructive. Scott recognized Ernest's talent immediately and helped him get published by Scribner's, the same house that published Scott's work. But there was jealousy too. Scott was the established writer, but he sensed that Ernest might surpass him. He was right. Ernest was also meeting other Americans who'd come to Paris to escape the narrowness of American culture. John Dos Passos, Archibald MacLeish. They talked about art, politics, the failure of civilization. They drank. They argued about Proust and Joyce. They watched the franc fluctuate and calculated how long their dollars would last. But the real education came from watching the city itself. the Parisian working class going about their lives, the shopkeepers, the waiters, the prostitutes around Montparnasse. Ernest studied them the way he'd studied the matadors, looking for what was true beneath the performance. Everyone performed, he was learning. The trick was finding the moments when the performance cracked and something real showed through. By 1925, Ernest had enough stories for a collection. In Our Time was published by Bonney and Liverights in New York. The reviews were mixed. Some critics recognized something new happening in American prose. Others found it cold, detached, pointless. The sales were terrible. But the book marked a beginning. Ernest Hemingway was now a published author, not just a journalist with ambitions. He was also becoming restless. Paris was wonderful, but he needed new material. The expatriate scene was starting to bore him. Same cafes, same conversations, same people getting drunk and pretending they were doing something important. He wanted out. In the summer of 1925, they went back to Pamplona. This time a group came along. Harold Loeb, Lady Duff Twisden, Pat Guthrie, Don Stewart. It should have been fun. It was a disaster. Duff was beautiful and drunk and sleeping with multiple people in the group. Harold was in love with her. Pat was her official boyfriend, but couldn't control her. Ernest watched the whole thing implode in real time. What he saw was material. These people, these supposedly sophisticated expatriates, were just as lost as everyone else. More lost, maybe, because they had money and education and still couldn't figure out how to live. They drank to forget what the war had done to them, slept around to feel something, travelled constantly because staying still meant facing themselves. Ernest started writing a novel. The characters were thinly disguised versions of the people from that summer. Jake Barnes, the narrator, was a war correspondent rendered impotent by a war wound, a physical manifestation of the spiritual impotence Ernest saw everywhere. Brett Ashley was Duff Twisden, the woman everyone wanted and no one could have. Robert Cohn was Harold Loeb, the outsider who didn't understand the rules. The novel poured out of him. He wrote with a clarity and speed he'd never experienced before. The voice was perfect. Jake's understated narration, never explaining, just showing what happened and letting readers draw their own conclusions. The structure worked, the dialogue crackled. For the first time, Ernest knew he was writing something that mattered. The Sun Also Rises was finished by 1926. Scribner's published it that October. The reviews were strong. The sales were decent. More importantly, the book captured something essential about the post-war generation. These weren't heroes or villains. They were people trying to get through the day without falling apart, using alcohol and sex and travel as anesthesia. The title came from Ecclesiastes. One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth. It was perfect. Generations come and go, but the world keeps turning, indifferent to human suffering. You do what you can, and then you die. The trick is doing it with some style, but success brought complications. Ernest's marriage was fraying. Hadley had been patient, supportive, everything a writer's wife was supposed to be. But Ernest was changing. He'd found success, found his voice, and suddenly the woman who'd believed in him when no one else did wasn't enough anymore. Enter Pauline Pfeiffer. She was a fashion writer for Vogue, wealthy, Catholic, sophisticated in ways Hadley wasn't. She and her sister Ginny had befriended Ernest and Hadley in Paris. Pauline paid attention to Ernest in a way that made him feel seen. She understood his ambition. She had money of her own, which meant he wouldn't have to worry about supporting her. The affair developed slowly, then quickly. By early 1926, it was obvious to everyone what was happening. Hadley knew. She gave Ernest an ultimatum. Choose. 100 days apart from Pauline. If after that separation he still wanted to leave, she'd grant a divorce. Ernest chose Pauline. In January 1927, he and Hadley divorced. It was brutal. Hadley was destroyed. Ernest felt guilty, but not guilty enough to change course. He married Pauline in May. The speed was indecent. Hadley's friends stopped speaking to him. Ernest didn't care. He'd made his choice. Pauline's uncle Gus gave them money. Real money. Enough to stop worrying about francs and exchange rates and whether the next check would arrive in time. Ernest and Pauline moved to Key West, Florida. It was hot, cheap, far from Paris and all the complications they were leaving behind. Key West in 1928 was nothing like it is now. A small fishing village at the end of the road, closer to Havana than to Miami in temperament. Ernest loved it immediately. The fishing was extraordinary. Marlin, tarpon, sailfish. He bought a boat, learned the waters, spent his days on the Gulf Stream. But he was also writing. A Farewell to Arms was taking shape, the novel about his war experience and his love affair with the Red Cross nurse who'd broken his heart. He'd been carrying those memories for a decade, and now they were ready to become fiction. The writing went well, then terribly, then well again. He rewrote the ending dozens of times, trying to find the right note. How do you end a story about love destroyed by war? What tone captures the waste, the futility, the tenderness that somehow survives despite everything? He finally found it. The ending is devastating in its simplicity. Catherine dies in childbirth. The baby dies. Frederick Henry walks out into the rain. That's it. No redemption, no meaning, just loss and the knowledge that loss is all there is. A Farewell to Arms was published in September 1929, just weeks after the market crashed. While America descended into the Depression, Ernest Hemingway became rich and famous. The novel was a massive bestseller. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. Hollywood bought the rights. Ernest was 30 years old and at the peak of his powers. But something was changing in him. Success brought pressure. People expected the next book to be even better. Critics were watching, waiting for him to fail. And Ernest was discovering that being Ernest Hemingway, the famous writer, was different from being Ernest Hemingway, the hungry kid trying to prove himself. He responded by doubling down on the persona. The adventurer, the sportsman, the man's man who could outdrink anyone and catch bigger fish. It wasn't entirely fake. He genuinely loved hunting and fishing, but he was also performing now, living up to the image people had of him. Pauline gave birth to their first son, Patrick, in 1928. Their second son, Gregory, came in 1931. Ernest was a father of 3 now, though Bumby lived with Hadley most of the time. Domesticity didn't suit him. He grew restless in Key West, needed to escape, needed new adventures to write about. In 1933, he found his next escape. Africa. The safari would change everything, though not in the ways he expected. Pauline's uncle Gus funded it. 10 weeks in East Africa, hunting big game with professional guides. They left in December, sailed to Mombasa, then travelled inland to Nairobi and beyond. The hunting was extraordinary. Ernest shot kudu, lion, buffalo. He was in his element, testing himself against dangerous animals, proving something to himself that he could never quite articulate. The guide was Philip Percival, the same man who'd taken Theodore Roosevelt on safari in 1909. Percival was everything Ernest admired. Calm, competent, unflappable. He knew the land, the animals, the rhythms of the hunt. Ernest absorbed everything, taking notes, watching how Percival read tracks, how he positioned hunters for the best shot. But Africa also nearly killed him. He contracted amoebic dysentery, a brutal intestinal infection. His gut was destroyed. He developed a prolapsed intestine and had to be evacuated by plane to Nairobi. The pain was excruciating. He spent weeks recovering, weak and humiliated by his body's betrayal. The safari gave him material for 3 major works: Green Hills of Africa, his account of the hunt itself, and 2 of his greatest short stories, The Snows of Kilimanjaro and The Short Happy Life of Francis Macumber. Both stories deal with death, cowardice, and the question of what makes a man worth anything. Kilimanjaro is about a writer dying of gangrene on an African plain, reviewing his wasted talent and failed life. It's one of Ernest's most autobiographical works, though he'd deny it. The protagonist, Harry, is bitter about his compromises, about marrying for money, about writing magazine stories instead of real literature. He knows he had talent once. He knows he sold it for comfort. The leopard frozen near the summit of Kilimanjaro, the image that opens the story, is never explained. What was it seeking at that altitude? The story doesn't say. It's just there, a mystery, like Harry's wasted potential. Francis Macumber is different. It's about a wealthy coward who finally finds his courage on a buffalo hunt, then is immediately shot dead by his wife. Was it an accident or murder? The story leaves it ambiguous. What's clear is that Macumber's moment of transformation, his brief period of genuine courage, made him dangerous to the wife who'd controlled him through his weakness. Both stories are brutal. They offer no redemption, no second chances. You get one life. If you waste it, that's on you. If you find courage, it might destroy you anyway. This was Ernest's philosophy, distilled to its essence. Back in Key West, Ernest's marriage to Pauline was fraying. They fought constantly. He was drinking heavily, growing paranoid about his work, convinced that critics were out to destroy him. He needed another project, another adventure. Spain gave it to him. In July 1936, the Spanish Civil War erupted. Fascist generals, led by Francisco Franco, rebelled against the democratically elected Republican government. It was a preview of World War II, with Germany and Italy backing Franco, while the Soviet Union supported the Republicans. Most of the world watched. Some volunteered to fight. Ernest didn't fight, but he went. In 1937, he travelled to Spain as a war correspondent for the North American Newspaper Alliance. He also helped raise money for the Loyalist cause, giving speeches, writing articles, making the case that this was civilization's fight against fascism. Spain consumed him. He made 4 trips between 1937 and 1938, spending months in Madrid while the city was under siege. He stayed at the Hotel Florida, which was regularly shelled. He drank in the Chicote bar with other correspondents, writers, and fighters. He met Martha Gellhorn. Martha was 28, blonde, beautiful, and fearless. She was also a journalist covering the war for Collier's. She'd grown up wealthy in St. Louis, gone to Bryn Mawr, worked for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. She had talent, ambition, and no patience for men who tried to diminish her. Ernest was smitten immediately. Martha was everything Pauline wasn't. Adventurous, independent, intellectually challenging. She didn't need him. That made her irresistible. They had an affair in Madrid, in between covering the war. It was passionate, reckless, conducted in a city where death was random and constant. Shells fell on the hotel. People died in the streets, and in the midst of it, Ernest fell in love. The war itself was a nightmare. Ernest witnessed the bombing of civilians, the execution of prisoners, the slow strangulation of Madrid as Franco's forces closed in. He saw the international brigades, volunteers from around the world, who'd come to fight fascism. Many were communists. Ernest sympathized with their cause but distrusted their ideology. He was gathering material for what would become For Whom the Bell Tolls, the novel about Robert Jordan, an American dynamiter attached to a Republican guerrilla unit. Jordan's mission is to blow up a bridge during an offensive. He knows the mission is probably doomed. He does it anyway. The title comes from John Donne. No man is an island, entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Ernest had found his theme. Individual action in the face of inevitable defeat. Courage without illusion. Commitment to a cause even when you know it's lost. He returned to Key West between trips to Spain. Pauline knew about Martha. Everyone knew. Ernest didn't bother hiding it. The marriage was over, even if neither of them had admitted it yet. In 1939, Ernest began writing For Whom the Bell Tolls in Havana. He'd rented a room at the Hotel Ambos Mundos, a rundown place in old Havana that he loved for its isolation and view of the harbour. Martha pushed him to get a real house. She didn't want to live in a hotel room. They found Finca Vigia Lookout Farm on a hill outside Havana. 15 acres, a Spanish colonial house, mango trees, a pool. Ernest rented it, then bought it after marrying Martha. It would be his home for the next 20 years, the longest he'd live anywhere. The writing of For Whom the Bell Tolls went fast. He worked every morning, standing at a bookcase he used as a desk, writing in pencil. By afternoon, he was done. He'd fish, drink, see friends. The novel poured out of him. It's his longest book, over 400 pages, and it's his most directly political. Robert Jordan is disillusioned with communist tactics, but committed to the Republican cause. He falls in love with Maria, a young woman traumatized by rape and violence. Their relationship is tender, doomed, and absolutely convincing. The novel builds toward the bridge explosion with inexorable momentum. Jordan knows the mission is compromised. He knows people will die for nothing. He does his job anyway because that's all there is. The individual act in the face of futility. Ernest finished the book in July 1940 at the Barclay Hotel in New York. It was published in October and became his biggest success. It sold 500,000 copies in the first 6 months. Critics called it his masterpiece. Hollywood paid $150,000 for the film rights, an enormous sum. But the book's success couldn't save his marriage to Pauline. In November 1940, he divorced her and married Martha. It was his third marriage, and it started with the same intensity as the others. But the pattern was already clear. Ernest fell hard, married fast, then grew bored and restless, and started looking for the next woman who'd make him feel alive again. Martha was different from Hadley and Pauline. She had her own career, her own money, her own ambitions. She wasn't content to be Mrs. Hemingway, managing the house while Ernest worked. She wanted to report on the war that was consuming Europe. And Ernest, now 41, was facing something he'd never had to confront before. His body was failing. The African dysentery had damaged his intestines permanently. He had chronic pain, digestive problems, couldn't eat the way he used to. The old wounds from Italy ached. His drinking, which had always been heavy, was becoming a problem he couldn't ignore. He was also struggling with the question of what came next. He'd written his big war novel. He'd made his statement about Spain, about fascism, about individual courage in a world gone mad. What was left? The answer came from an unexpected direction. A world war that would dwarf Spain, that would consume everything and everyone, that would give Ernest one more chance to test himself against history, one more chance to prove he wasn't finished yet. World War II began in September 1939. Ernest was in Cuba, 40 years old, married to Martha, working on For Whom the Bell Tolls. The war felt distant. Europe's problem, not his. But Martha wouldn't let him ignore it. She'd been a war correspondent since Spain. She wanted to cover this one too. She pushed Ernest to get accredited, to go to Europe, to see what was happening. He resisted. He was writing. The book was going well. Why leave? The real reason was fear, not of combat, but of irrelevance. He was 41. The young man who'd been wounded in Italy was gone. Could he still do what he'd done at 18? Could he still be Papa Hemingway, larger than life, in the middle of the action? He spent 1941 and 1942 mostly in Cuba. He outfitted his fishing boat, the Pilar, with radio equipment and machine guns, supposedly to hunt for German submarines in the Caribbean. It was absurd, an amateur navy of one, but it gave him something to do, some way to feel useful. The marriage to Martha was already cracking. She wanted to work. He wanted her home. She thought his submarine hunting was ridiculous. He thought her ambition was unfeminine. They fought constantly. In the spring of 1944, Martha got an assignment from Collier's to cover the war in Europe. Ernest, furious that she was going without him, called Collier's and got himself hired as their chief correspondent. This meant Martha lost her position. She had to find another magazine. It was a deliberately cruel move, and she never forgave him. Ernest flew to London in May 1944, just weeks before D-Day. He was carrying too much weight, drinking too much, but he was back in the game. He checked into the Dorchester Hotel and started meeting people, making contacts, positioning himself to be where the action would be. On May 23rd, driving back to London late at night after a party, drunk, he crashed his car into a steel water tank. The impact smashed his head into the windshield. He woke up in the hospital with a concussion, a gashed scalp that needed 57 stitches, double vision, and ringing in his ears that would last for weeks. While he was recovering, he met Mary Welsh, a Time magazine correspondent. She was married, so was he technically. Neither fact mattered. They started an affair immediately. Mary was different from Martha, smaller, quieter, more willing to adapt to Ernest's needs. She laughed at his jokes. She didn't challenge him the way Martha did. Ernest fell for her hard. But first there was a war to cover. On June 6, 1944, Ernest was on a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach. He couldn't actually land. Correspondents weren't allowed to go ashore on D-Day, so he watched from the boat as men waded into the water and were cut down by machine gun fire. He took notes. He drank from a flask. He felt useless. Later, he'd exaggerate his role, as he always did. He'd claim he was one of the first on the beach, that he'd seen things no one else saw. None of it was true. He watched from offshore. That was it. But what came next was real. After D-Day, Ernest attached himself to the 22nd Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Charles Buck Lanham. Lanham was a tough, literate officer who appreciated Ernest's intelligence and his willingness to share his liquor. They became close friends. Ernest embedded with the 22nd as they pushed through France. He wore a uniform, carried weapons, and increasingly acted not like a correspondent, but like a soldier. This was illegal. The Geneva Convention forbade correspondents from taking up arms. Ernest didn't care. In late July, as the Allies broke out of Normandy, Ernest was in Rambouillet, a small town southwest of Paris. The regular army hadn't arrived yet. Ernest gathered a group of French resistance fighters and set up operations in the Hôtel de Grand Veneur. He interrogated prisoners, he planned patrols, he sent men out on reconnaissance missions. He was, in effect, leading troops. This was a clear violation of the rules governing war correspondence. When the military found out, they brought him up on formal charges. At the hearing, Ernest claimed he'd only given advice, never commanded anyone. The charges were dropped, but everyone knew the truth. He loved it. For the first time since Italy, in 1918, he was back in combat. Not just writing about it, but participating. The adrenaline, the danger, the camaraderie of soldiers. This was what he lived for. On August 25th, 1944, Paris was liberated. Ernest was there, though not, as legend would have it, the first man into the city. He didn't personally liberate the Ritz Hotel, though that story would circulate for years. What he did do was make his way to the Ritz, find the bar, and start drinking champagne with anyone who'd join him. He stayed in Paris for weeks, holding court, telling stories, drinking. Martha was there too, working for a different magazine, staying at a different hotel. They barely spoke. The marriage was finished in everything but paperwork. Mary Welsh was in Paris too. She and Ernest made no secret of their relationship. Martha watched it happen and felt humiliated, angry, and ultimately relieved. She wanted out. By September, Ernest was back with the 22nd Regiment, now pushing into Germany. The fighting was brutal. The Germans were defending their homeland. Every village was contested. The casualties were staggering. The 22nd entered the Hürtgen forest in November. It was one of the bloodiest battles American forces would fight in Europe. Dense woods, mud, rain, German bunkers every few hundred yards. The regiment was decimated. Ernest watched men he'd drunk with, joked with, get killed or blown apart. He stayed through it. He didn't have to. Correspondents could leave whenever they wanted, but Ernest stayed with Lanham and the 22nd because that's what soldiers did. You didn't abandon your unit. The head injury from the May car crash was still causing problems. His vision would blur, his head ached constantly. He drank to manage the pain, which only made everything worse. He was 45 years old, overweight, exhausted, and probably suffering from undiagnosed post-concussive syndrome. But he kept going. By December, when the Battle of the Bulge began, Ernest was in Luxembourg. He was there when the Germans launched their last major offensive. He saw the chaos, the retreat, the desperate fighting to hold the line. And he took notes. He always took notes. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Ernest had been there for nearly a year. He'd seen D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the Hürtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge. He'd been shelled, shot at, and nearly blown up more times than he could count. And he'd gotten what he came for, proof that he could still do it. That he wasn't too old, wasn't washed up, wasn't finished, but the cost was high. His marriage to Martha was over. She filed for divorce in 1945. He married Mary Welsh in March 1946, his fourth wife. He was 46, Mary was 37. She knew what she was signing up for. Ernest was Papa now, the legend, the larger-than-life figure. She accepted that role, mostly. The war had also done something to Ernest's writing. He tried to start a new novel, what would eventually become Across the River and Into the Trees, but it wasn't coming together. The war had given him material, but it had also exhausted him. The drinking was worse, the injuries were accumulating. His body wasn't recovering the way it used to. He went back to Cuba with Mary. Finca Vigia was still there, waiting. The servants, the cats, the tropical heat. He tried to settle into a routine. Write in the morning, fish in the afternoon, drink in the evening. But something had shifted. The war had proven he could still be Papa Hemingway, the man of action, but it had also shown him the limits. He wasn't 18 anymore. He wasn't the wounded hero carried to safety by Italian soldiers. He was a middle-aged man with bad knees, a scarred liver, and a head full of shrapnel memories. And the writing, which had always been the thing that mattered most, was getting harder. The war gave him stories, but it also took something from him. Some essential energy, some belief that he could keep doing this forever. He'd write one more great book, but it would take years to get there, and the journey to that book would nearly destroy him. For now, in 1946, back in Cuba, he was still Papa, still drinking, still fishing, still telling stories about Paris and the Ritz and the liberation and the Hürtgen Forest. But the cracks were starting to show. The question wasn't whether he could write another great book. The question was whether he had anything left to say, whether the war had used him up, whether Papa Hemingway, the myth, had finally eclipsed Ernest Hemingway, the writer. He'd spend the next few years finding out. The first thing Ernest did was try to write the war novel. Not right away. First came the drinking, the recovery, the settling into married life with Mary. But by late 1946, he was at the desk every morning, trying to turn everything he'd seen in Europe into something that mattered. It didn't work. The novel that would eventually become Across the River and Into the Trees was supposed to be his big comeback, his war book, the one that would prove he could still do it. But from the start, something was wrong. The prose felt forced. The character, a bitter old colonel dying of heart disease, was too close to Ernest himself. Too angry, too tired. He kept at it anyway. Wrote every morning at Finca Vigia, the same routine as always. But the pages weren't good. He knew it. Mary knew it. His friends who read the early drafts knew it. But Ernest couldn't stop. He'd spent too much time on this, invested too much of himself. The critics would savage it when it finally came out in 1950. They'd call it self-parody, a pale imitation of his earlier work. They weren't entirely wrong. But something else happened while he was struggling with that failed novel, something that would change everything. He started fishing more, not the deep-sea fishing he'd done in Key West, something different. He'd go out on his boat, the Pilar, with his mate Gregorio Fuentes, and they'd work the Gulf Stream, chase marlin, big ones, the fish that could pull a boat for hours. And he started talking to the fishermen in Cojimar, the little village near Havana, where many of them lived, old men who'd spent their entire lives on the water, men who knew the sea the way Ernest wanted to know it. One of them was named Gregorio, another was named Anselmo. There were others. They'd tell stories about the big fish, the ones that got away, the ones that didn't, the days when the sea was kind, and the days when it wasn't. Ernest listened. He always listened better than people gave him credit for. In 1950, while across the river and into the trees was dying in bookstores and critics were writing his obituary, Ernest started thinking about a different kind of story. Not about war, not about lost love or bullfights or Paris, about an old man and a fish. That's it, nothing else. He'd heard the story years before about a fisherman who hooked a marlin so big it pulled his boat for days, about how sharks came and ate the fish on the way back, about how the old man arrived in port with nothing but a skeleton. It stuck with him, the simplicity of it, the purity. And in December 1950, he started writing. Not the laboured, painful writing of the war novel, something different. The words came easy, clean, the way they used to. He wrote it fast, 8 weeks, maybe less. The story of Santiago, an old Cuban fisherman who hasn't caught a fish in 84 days, who goes out alone, hooks a marlin bigger than his boat, and fights it for 3 days, who kills it, lashes it to the side of his skiff, and watches as sharks tear it apart on the journey home. The old man arrives with nothing, just bones, but he's proven something, to himself if no one else. Ernest knew what he had. This wasn't like the war novel. This was real. This was what he'd been trying to write for 4 years and couldn't until he stopped trying so hard. He showed it to Mary. She cried. He showed it to his editor at Scribner's. They wanted to publish it immediately. Life magazine wanted to run the whole thing in a single issue. Life published The Old Man and the Sea on September 1st, 1952. 5 million copies sold in 2 days. People lined up at newsstands, read it on trains, passed it around offices. It was everywhere. Scribner's published the book version a week later. It shot to the top of the bestseller lists and stayed there for 6 months. Translated into 9 languages by the end of the year. Ernest was back, bigger than ever. But here's what most people miss about The Old Man and the Sea. It wasn't just a comeback. It was Ernest writing about himself, about getting old, about still having something left, about fighting even when you know you're going to lose. Santiago is Ernest. The Marlin is the great book he's been chasing his whole career. The sharks are time, critics, age, everything that tears away at what you've built. And the ending, coming back with nothing but bones. That's Ernest too. All the wars, all the marriages, all the drinking and fighting and proving himself. What does he have left? Just the work, just the writing. The book won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953. First time Ernest had won it. They'd passed him over for A Farewell to Arms, passed him over for Whom the Bell Tolls, but they couldn't ignore this. Then in 1954, the Nobel Prize. The announcement came in October. Ernest was in Cuba. He'd been out fishing when the phone call came. Mary took the message. Ernest Hemingway had won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was 55 years old. The citation read, for his mastery of the art of narrative, most recently demonstrated in The Old Man and the Sea, and for the influence that he has exerted on contemporary style. He didn't go to Stockholm to accept it, claimed he was too sick. The truth was more complicated. He was sick, yes, always sick now, but he was also terrified. Terrified of public speaking, terrified of being judged, terrified that he'd peaked and everyone would see it. So he sent a speech instead. Had the American ambassador read it? The speech talked about loneliness, about how a writer should always try for something that has never been done or that others have tried and failed. It was true. Ernest had always pushed, always tried to do what couldn't be done, and mostly he'd succeeded, but the cost was accumulating. Because here's what was happening beneath the surface of all this success. The Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer, the old man, and the sea-breaking records. Underneath, Ernest was falling apart. The drinking was out of control. Had been for years, but now it was worse. He'd start in the morning, whiskey in his coffee, wine with lunch, cocktails in the afternoon, whiskey again at night. He wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. His weight ballooned, then crashed, then ballooned again. The injuries from the war, from the car accidents, from the plane crashes in Africa that hadn't happened yet but would soon, all of it was catching up. His liver was failing. His kidneys were struggling. His blood pressure was through the roof. And his mind. That was changing too. The paranoia that had always been there, the sense that people were out to get him, it was getting worse. He thought the FBI was watching him, thought his phones were tapped. He wasn't entirely wrong about the FBI, they did have a file on him, but his fear went beyond rational concern. Mary held it together, tried to manage him, tried to keep him functional. But you can't manage someone who doesn't want to be managed. Ernest did what Ernest wanted, always had. In January 1954, 2 months after winning the Nobel Prize, Ernest and Mary went to Africa. He wanted to go on safari again, wanted to recapture what he'd found there in 1933. The hunting, the adventure, the feeling of being alive. They chartered a plane to see Murchison Falls from the air. A Christmas present, Ernest called it. The plane hit an abandoned utility pole, crashed in the bush. Ernest's back was injured, his shoulder. Mary had broken ribs. They spent the night in the wilderness, then found a boat on the river that took them to Butiaba. A pilot there said he could fly them out. The plane took off. The landing strip was too rough. The plane exploded. Mary and the pilot escaped through a window. Ernest had to smash his way out, using his head as a battering ram. The door wouldn't open. He broke it with his skull. Burns, another head injury, worse than anything before. Cerebral fluid leaked from the wound. He couldn't see properly, couldn't hear, his balance was gone. They got him to a hospital, then another. The extent of the injuries came out slowly. 2 cracked discs, kidney damage, liver rupture, dislocated shoulder, fractured skull. He should have died, everyone said so. The newspapers ran his obituary. Ernest Hemingway, killed in plane crash in Africa. He was 54, except he wasn't dead. He read his own obituaries from a hospital bed. Read what people really thought of him. Some of it was kind, some wasn't. He joked about it later. Said it was interesting to see what they'd say when you couldn't argue back. But it wasn't funny. It was devastating. Reading your own death notice does something to you. Makes mortality real in a way it wasn't before. They flew back to Cuba. Ernest was broken, not just physically. Something inside had cracked. The invincibility he'd maintained since Italy in 1918, since the shrapnel and the machine gun fire and carrying that soldier to safety, it was gone. He tried to write, couldn't. The head injury had done something. Made it hard to focus, hard to hold a thought. The sentences that used to come clean and simple, now tangled, confused. He drank more. To deal with the pain, he said. But it made everything worse. His liver couldn't process it. His kidneys couldn't filter it. His brain couldn't function through it. Mary watched him deteriorate. Watched the man she'd married, the Papa Hemingway everyone knew, disappear into someone she didn't recognize. Someone paranoid. Someone angry. Someone scared. And Ernest knew it was happening. That was the worst part. He could feel himself slipping, could feel the writing getting harder, could feel his body giving up, could feel his mind going. But he couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, couldn't admit that maybe, finally, he'd reached his limit. He'd won the Nobel Prize. He'd written The Old Man and the Sea. He'd proven one last time that he could still do it. But the question now wasn't whether he could write another great book. The question was whether he could survive long enough to try. By the late 1950s, Cuba had become unstable. Fidel Castro's revolution was gaining momentum. The government Ernest had known, the one that left him alone to write and fish and drink, was collapsing. In 1959, Castro took power. Everything changed. The Americans who'd lived in Cuba for years started leaving. The diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba deteriorated fast. Ernest tried to stay, tried to maintain his life at Finca Vigia, but it was becoming impossible. The new government viewed Americans with suspicion. The FBI back home viewed anyone who stayed in Cuba with suspicion. Ernest was caught between worlds again. The finca had been his longest home. 20 years. Longer than Paris, longer than Key West, longer than anywhere. The manuscripts were there. The books. The memories. The cats. The life he'd built. But by 1960 it was clear he couldn't stay. Mary convinced him to leave. They'd come back, she said, when things settled down. They never did. Ernest and Mary moved to Ketchum, Idaho. He'd been going there since 1939. Long autumn stays in the Wood River Valley, hunting, fishing, the mountains. It reminded him of Michigan, of those early summers at Walloon Lake with his father, learning to hunt and fish and be in the woods, before everything got complicated. They bought a house there in 1959, a concrete structure on a hillside overlooking the Big Wood River. Modern, clean, nothing like the finca, but it was supposed to be temporary, a place to stay while Cuba sorted itself out. Except Cuba never sorted itself out, and Ernest never went back. The depression that had been building for years got worse, much worse. He'd always had dark periods, times when the work wouldn't come, when the drinking increased, when he turned mean and suspicious. But this was different. This was clinical. Paralyzing. He couldn't write. The head injuries from the plane crashes had done something permanent, made it hard to focus, hard to hold a thought long enough to get it on paper. The sentences that used to come clean and simple, now tangled, confused. He'd start writing and lose the thread. Forget what he was trying to say. He'd stare at the page and nothing would come. For a man who'd built his entire identity on being a writer, this was death. Worse than death, it was watching yourself disappear while still breathing. He became paranoid, convinced the FBI was watching him, following him, recording his movements. Mary tried to tell him it wasn't real, that no one was watching, but he was certain. He'd point out cars he said were surveillance, people he claimed were agents. He believed his phone was tapped, his mail opened, his bank accounts monitored. And here's the thing, he was partially right. The FBI had kept a file on Hemingway since the 1940s. J. Edgar Hoover was suspicious of anyone who'd spent time in Cuba, who'd supported the Loyalists in Spain, who'd lived among leftists in Paris. The file existed, but it wasn't the active surveillance Ernest believed it was. The paranoia had taken a seed of truth and grown it into a conspiracy that consumed him. He worried constantly about money. Despite being one of the most successful writers in the world, despite the Nobel Prize and the Pulitzer and the decades of bestsellers, he was convinced he was going broke. He'd check his bank statements obsessively, question every expense. He believed Mary was spending too much, that his publishers were cheating him, that the government was going to take everything. None of it was true. He was wealthy, secure, but the paranoia made it impossible to see reality, made him believe he was on the edge of financial ruin. The drinking got worse. His liver couldn't handle it anymore. Neither could his kidneys. The doctors told him to stop. He couldn't, or wouldn't. The alcohol was the only thing that quieted the noise in his head, the only thing that made the paranoia recede, the only thing that let him sleep, even though it was killing him, even though it made everything worse in the long run. In the moment, it was the only relief he had. Mary watched it all happen, watched Papa Hemingway disappear. The man she'd married, the force of nature, who'd stormed through World War II and written masterpieces and lived larger than anyone she'd known, was gone. In his place was someone frightened, someone fragile, someone she barely recognized. She tried to help, called doctors, tried to manage his drinking, tried to keep him stable, but she couldn't do it alone. And Ernest wouldn't admit he needed help, wouldn't accept that something was wrong. To admit mental illness would be to admit weakness. And weakness was the one thing Ernest Hemingway had spent his entire life refusing to show. In October 1960, things reached a crisis point. Ernest refused to leave Mary's apartment in New York, believed he was being watched, wouldn't go outside. Mary called Dr. George Sarviers, their physician in Ketchum. Sarviers flew to New York, convinced Ernest to come back to Idaho, but once they got there, it was clear Ernest needed more help than Sarviers could provide. In November, Sarviers made arrangements. Ernest would go to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, the most famous hospital in the world, under the cover story that he was being treated for hypertension, high blood pressure, a respectable illness, not mental illness, never that. The truth was severe clinical depression, paranoia, possibly early signs of dementia from the multiple head injuries, the repeated concussions, the skull fractures, the cerebral fluid leaks. His brain had been damaged, physically damaged, and now the damage was showing. At Mayo, they registered him under the name George Sarviers, his doctor's name, to protect his privacy, to keep the press from finding out that Ernest Hemingway was being treated for mental illness. The stigma would have been devastating for a man whose image was built on strength, on toughness, on being able to handle anything. Admitting he couldn't handle his own mind was impossible. The treatment they gave him was electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, electroshock. They'd send electric currents through his brain to trigger seizures, 40 seconds of violent convulsions. The theory was that it would reset the brain chemistry, alleviate the depression. It was common treatment at the time for severe cases, and in some ways it worked. The depression lifted, the paranoia decreased. Ernest seemed better, but there was a cost. The treatments destroyed his memory, wiped out large sections of it, made it impossible to access the experiences he needed for his writing. He couldn't remember details, couldn't recall the precise observations that made his prose work, the clean, hard facts that built his sentences. He stayed at Mayo for 2 months, underwent at least 15 electroshock treatments. When he was released in January 1961, he seemed improved. The doctors said he was better. Mary wanted to believe it. Ernest tried to write, sat at his desk, stared at the page. Nothing came. The words were gone. The ability to put one sentence after another, the thing he'd done since he was 17 years old, was gone. He told a friend that the treatments had wiped out his memory, that he couldn't write anymore, that they'd destroyed the one thing that made him who he was. He was right. The depression had lifted, but the cost was everything that mattered. The electroshock had saved his mind by destroying his ability to use it. In April, Mary found him in the kitchen with a shotgun. She called Sarviers. He came immediately, got Ernest to the Sun Valley Hospital, sedated him, then made arrangements to fly back to Mayo. Ernest went, underwent 3 more electroshock treatments, was released at the end of June, came home to Ketchum on June 30th, 1961. 2 days later, early in the morning on July 2nd, he unlocked the basement storage room where the guns were kept, selected his favourite shotgun, a Boss double barrel, went to the foyer, put the gun to his head, and pulled the trigger. Mary was asleep upstairs. The gunshot woke her. She came down and found him, called the authorities, told them it was an accident, that he'd been cleaning the gun, that it had gone off. She knew the truth, but admitting suicide meant admitting everything. The mental illness, the treatment, the failure. It was easier to call it an accident, to let people believe Papa Hemingway had died in a tragic mishap. Not that he'd chosen to die, not that he'd decided The world without the ability to write wasn't worth living in. The funeral was small. Family and close friends, held in Ketchum. The local Catholic priest officiated. He believed the death had been accidental. Gave Ernest the full Catholic funeral rites. Mary didn't correct him. 5 years later, in a press interview, she finally admitted the truth, that Ernest had shot himself, that it hadn't been an accident, that he'd chosen to end it. But by then, the initial story had set. Most people still believed it was an accident, or wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too sad, too final, too much an admission that even Ernest Hemingway, Papa, the man who'd survived wars and plane crashes and revolutions, couldn't survive his own mind. They buried him in the Ketchum cemetery, a simple grave, no elaborate monument, just a headstone with his name, July 21st, 1899 to July 2nd, 1961. 61 years old. It wasn't old, not for a writer. Faulkner had lived to 64. Fitzgerald hadn't made it to 45, but Hemingway should have had more time, should have had another decade, another book, another chance to prove he could still do it. But the head injuries took that. The electroshock took that. The depression took that. Or maybe he'd just used himself up, burned through everything he had, lived so hard and so fast and so intensely that there was nothing left. No reserve. No way to keep going when the writing stopped. The question everyone asked was why? Why would someone who'd won the Nobel Prize, who'd written some of the most important books of the century, who had money and fame and everything most people dream of, why would he do it? The answer is complicated. Depression doesn't care about success. Mental illness doesn't care about achievement. The brain chemistry that fails doesn't check your resume first. But there's more to it than that. Ernest's identity was completely tied to his ability to write. When that was gone, when the electroshock treatments had destroyed his memory and his ability to access the experiences he needed to create, he had nothing left. He wasn't Ernest Hemingway, the person. He was Ernest Hemingway, the writer. And without the writing, he was no one. The legacy he left behind was enormous. The books, the style, the influence on every writer who came after. The short sentences, the iceberg theory, the code hero, the clean prose, all of it changed American literature, made it possible to write about war and love and loss without sentimentality, without decoration, just the facts, just what happened. And somehow, in that restraint, in that refusal to explain everything, he captured truth more completely than writers who use 3 times as many words. But the personal legacy was complicated. 4 marriages, 3 sons, relationships damaged by his drinking, his infidelity, his need to be the center of attention, always. People who loved him but couldn't live with him, couldn't handle the mood swings, the cruelty when he drank, the competitiveness, the need to win every argument, every fight, every contest. His son struggled. Gregory became a doctor but battled gender dysphoria and addiction. Patrick dealt with depression. Bumby, the oldest, was probably the most stable, but even he had complicated feelings about his father, about the myth of Papa Hemingway versus the reality of Ernest the father, about what it meant to grow up in that shadow, about whether the books were worth the cost. The question isn't whether they were worth it. The question is whether anything could have been worth that cost, whether any art justifies that much damage, that much pain. You can't separate Hemingway's work from his life. The two are tangled together so completely that pulling them apart would destroy both. The experiences that broke him were the same experiences that made the books possible. The wars, the wounds, the relationships that failed, the drinking, the obsession with death and courage and what it means to keep going when everything inside you wants to stop. A Farewell to Arms comes directly from his time in Italy, from the mortar shell that nearly killed him, from falling in love with Agnes von Kurowski in that Milan hospital. The Sun Also Rises is Paris in the 20s. The bullfights, the drinking, the friendships that were really competitions, for whom the bell tolls is Spain. Watching men die for a cause that was already lost. The Old Man and the Sea is Cuba. The fisherman from Kojima who became Santiago. All of it real. All of it lived. But living it cost him everything. The head injuries from the plane crashes. The depression that started in his 20s and never left. The paranoia that got worse every year. The drinking that was supposed to help but only made everything worse. The marriages that fell apart because he couldn't be what anyone needed him to be. The sons who grew up watching their father destroy himself slowly and then quickly. Gregory Hemingway changed his name, became a doctor, struggled with gender identity and addiction his whole life, died in 2001 in a Miami jail cell, arrested for indecent exposure while wearing women's clothing, 69 years old. The coroner listed the cause of death as hypertension and cardiovascular disease, but really it was decades of trying to be someone his father could have accepted, of never quite managing it. Patrick dealt with depression, had breakdowns, spent time in institutions, recovered enough to have a life, but never escaped the shadow. Never stopped being Ernest Hemingway's son first and Patrick Hemingway second. Bumby was more stable, became Jack Hemingway, had a career, raised a family. But even he wrote a memoir that was really about trying to understand his father, about reconciling Papa the legend with Ernest the man, about what it meant to grow up in a household where your father's work always came first, where you were expected to be tough, to never complain, to handle things. The book survived. That's what matters to literature. That's what matters to the millions of people who've read them over the past century, who learned from them how to write without sentimentality, how to show instead of tell, how to make every word count. But to the people who actually knew him, who lived with him, who loved him, the question is harder. Was it worth it? Should he have lived differently, written less, taken better care of himself, chosen happiness over art? There's no good answer to that. You can't run the experiment again, can't see what would have happened if he'd stayed in Oak Park, married someone local, worked as a journalist, never went to war, never got wounded, never moved to Paris, never became Ernest Hemingway the writer, just stayed Ernest Hemingway the person. Maybe he would have been happier, maybe he would have lived longer, maybe his sons would have had a father who was actually present, who didn't disappear into his work or into a bottle, who didn't turn cruel when he drank, who didn't make everyone around him walk on eggshells trying not to set him off. But we wouldn't have the books, and the books changed everything, not just literature, the whole culture, the way we think about war, about masculinity, about courage, about what it means to write truthfully. Before Hemingway, American prose was different, more ornate, more willing to explain everything, more comfortable with sentimentality. He stripped all that away, made it clean, made it direct, made it honest in a way that felt revolutionary. The iceberg theory wasn't just a writing technique, it was a philosophy. What you leave out is as important as what you put in. The reader should feel the weight of what's not said, should understand that beneath every simple sentence is an ocean of experience and emotion that doesn't need to be spelled out. That changed how everyone wrote afterward. You can trace a direct line from Hemingway to Raymond Carver, to Cormac McCarthy, to Joan Didion, to hundreds of other writers who learned from him that less is more, that restraint has power, that the things you don't say can hit harder than the things you do. His influence on journalism was just as significant. The Kansas City Star-style guide that shaped his early writing became the model for modern journalism. Short sentences, active verbs, concrete details, no editorializing, just the facts presented clearly enough that readers could draw their own conclusions. War correspondence changed because of him. Before Hemingway, war reporting was mostly propaganda or abstract descriptions of troop movements and strategic objectives. He showed that you could report on war by focusing on individual people, on what they said and did and how they died, on the specific details that made it real. When he wrote about the Spanish Civil War or World War II, He wasn't writing about nations and ideologies. He was writing about scared kids in foxholes, about refugees fleeing with everything they owned on their backs, about what a city looks like after it's been shelled, the particulars that made readers understand war viscerally instead of abstractly. But he paid for that understanding. You don't embed yourself with troops in combat without it changing you. You don't watch people die without it leaving marks. The material for his best war writing came from experiences that traumatized him. That fed the depression. That made it harder to sleep, harder to stop drinking, harder to be anything other than what the war had made him. There's a pattern in creative lives where the same qualities that enable greatness also guarantee suffering. Hemingway's obsessive need for authentic experience drove him to seek out danger, to volunteer for the ambulance corps when he could have sat out World War I, to go to Spain when he could have stayed safe in Key West, to attach himself to combat units in World War II when his job was just to observe. That obsession gave him the material, the authority, the right to write about war because he'd been there. He'd been wounded. He'd seen friends die. He knew what he was talking about in a way most writers never would. But it also meant he couldn't stop, couldn't settle down, couldn't be content with a quiet life. Always needed the next adventure, the next war, the next dangerous hunt, the next test of his courage. Because if he wasn't testing himself, who was he? What was he worth? The drinking followed the same pattern. It helped him relax, helped him socialize, helped him feel like himself in a way that sobriety didn't. But it also destroyed his health, ruined his marriages, made him cruel, made him paranoid, made him say things he couldn't take back, do things he'd regret when sober. By the end, he was drinking to function, drinking to write, drinking to sleep, drinking to forget that he couldn't write anymore. The thing that had helped became the thing that hurt. But he couldn't stop because stopping would mean facing everything he'd been running from. All the pain, all the fear, all the accumulated weight of 60 years lived at full intensity. The electroshock treatments were supposed to help, were supposed to reset something in his brain that had gone wrong. But they took his memory, took his ability to access the experiences he needed to write, took the only thing that had ever really mattered to him. After that, what was left? A man who couldn't do the one thing that made him who he was, who couldn't write, couldn't remember the stories he wanted to tell, couldn't even remember the stories he'd already told. Just fragments, pieces, nothing he could use. Mary tried to help, tried to support him, tried to get him treatment. But how do you help someone whose entire identity is built on something they can't do anymore? How do you convince them that life is worth living when the thing that made it worth living is gone? You can't. That's the answer. You can't save someone from themselves when they've decided they're finished, when they've looked at what's left and decided it's not enough, that living as a shadow of who they were is worse than not living at all. The morning of July 2nd, 1961, Ernest Hemingway made that decision, took his favourite shotgun, the one he'd used for hunting, the one he'd trusted for years, and he used it one last time, on himself, in the foyer of his house in Ketchum while Mary slept upstairs. When she found him, she knew, but she told the press it was an accident, told them he'd been cleaning the gun, told them anything except the truth, because the truth was too hard, too final, too much an admission that even Ernest Hemingway, with all his strength and all his courage and all his determination, couldn't beat this. The funeral was quiet. The priest thought it was an accident. The family didn't correct him. They buried Ernest in the Ketchum cemetery under a simple headstone. No elaborate speeches, no grand memorial. Just a man who'd lived hard and died hard and left behind books that would outlive everyone who knew him. That's the legacy. Not the marriages, not the drinking, not the cruelty or the competitiveness or the need to always be the toughest guy in the room. The books, the sentences, the stories that captured something true about human experience, about war and love and loss and courage and what it costs to keep going. Whether that justifies everything else is a question everyone has to answer for themselves. The people who loved him and were hurt by him might answer differently than the people who only know him through his work. The sons who grew up in his shadow might have a different perspective than the readers who found meaning in his sentences. But the work is here. It exists. It changed literature, changed how we write, changed how we think about storytelling. And it came from a real person who lived a real life and paid a real price for the experiences that made the work possible. You can't wish away the pain without wishing away the books. Can't separate the art from the artist when the art was built from the artist's actual life, from his wounds and his fears and his failures and his rare moments of grace. Ernest Hemingway's life was a tragedy, a brilliant, productive, influential tragedy that gave us some of the most important literature of the 20th century and left behind a trail of damage that his family is still dealing with decades later. Both things are true, the greatness and the cost, the achievement and the destruction. You don't get to pick one and ignore the other. You have to hold both. Have to understand that this is what it looks like when someone burned that bright, when someone lived that intensely, when someone turned their entire life into material. Now you know what that actually means, what it costs, what it creates, and whether it was worth it. The books remain. That's what we're left with. Not the man, but what the man made. The sun also rises. A farewell to arms, for whom the bell tolls, the old man and the sea, and dozens of short stories that changed how fiction works. Students still read them in schools. Writers still study them, trying to figure out how he did it, how he made simple sentences carry so much weight, how he wrote about violence without glorifying it, about love without sentimentalizing it, about death without flinching. The answer is he lived it first. Every word came from something real, something experienced, something that left a mark. You can't fake that kind of authenticity. You can't manufacture it in a writing workshop. It has to be earned through actual living, actual suffering, actual joy. But here's what nobody tells you about that approach. Living for your art means your art consumes your life, means you can't just be a person anymore. You become material. Everything that happens to you, everyone you love, every mistake you make, it all goes into the work. Gets transformed into sentences and paragraphs and stories. The people around you become characters. Your pain becomes plot. Your failures become themes. Nothing is sacred, nothing is off limits. Everything is potential material. Hadley learned this. So did Pauline, Martha and Mary. They all discovered that being married to Ernest Hemingway meant being married to someone who was always watching, always taking notes, always turning life into literature. Even the intimate moments, even the fights, even the things that should have stayed private. His sons learned it too. Learned that having Ernest Hemingway as a father meant growing up in a laboratory. Everything you did was observed, judged, measured against some code of behaviour that was never quite explained but always enforced. You were supposed to be tough, supposed to handle things, supposed to never complain. And if you couldn't meet that standard, if you showed weakness or fear or just normal human vulnerability, you were disappointing him, failing some test he'd never told you about but expected you to pass anyway. That's brutal. That's damaging. That's the kind of thing that creates the patterns Gregory and Patrick struggled with their entire lives. The depression, the addiction, the feeling that you could never be good enough, never measure up, never escape the shadow. But it also created the books, the specific books we have, written in that specific style, with that specific understanding of courage and cowardice, and what it means to live with integrity in a world that doesn't reward it. You can argue about whether the trade was worth it, whether any amount of artistic achievement justifies that much collateral damage, whether we should celebrate someone who was brilliant and successful, and also cruel and selfish and destructive. There's no simple answer. People have been arguing about it since before Ernest died. We'll probably keep arguing about it for as long as people read his work. What we can say is this: he succeeded at what he set out to do. He wanted to write sentences that were true, that captured experience without lying about it, or decorating it, or making it prettier than it was. He wanted to show violence and love and death as they actually happened, not as people wish they happened. He did that, better than almost anyone. The prose is clean, direct, honest. You read it and you trust it. You believe the narrator knows what he's talking about, has been there, has seen it, isn't making anything up. That trust is earned through craft, yes, through careful attention to rhythm and word choice, and what to include and what to leave out. But it's also earned through authority, through the reader's knowledge that Ernest Hemingway actually went to war, actually got wounded, actually hunted lions in Africa and marlin in Cuba, actually lived the experiences he wrote about. The life authenticated the work, made it possible for readers to believe that these weren't just made-up stories, but truth filtered through fiction, real experience transformed into art. That transformation is what literature does at its best. It takes the chaos of actual living and shapes it into something that makes sense, that reveals patterns, that shows us something about human nature we wouldn't have understood otherwise. Ernest spent his entire life doing that, taking his experiences, the good and the terrible, and turning them into stories, into sentences, into books that would outlast him, that would keep finding new readers long after everyone who knew him personally was gone. He succeeded. The books are still here, still being read, still teaching writers how to write, still showing readers what prose can do when it's stripped down to essentials, when every word counts, when nothing is wasted. But the cost was everything: his health, his relationships, his sanity, his ability to keep going when the writing stopped, when the electroshock treatments took his memory and left him unable to access the very experiences that had made the work possible. At that point, what was Ernest Hemingway without the ability to write? Who was he when the one thing that defined him was gone? The answer is nobody. At least nobody he recognized. Nobody he could accept being, so he chose not to be. That's the final tragedy. Not that he died, everyone dies, but that he died believing he'd lost the only thing that mattered, the only thing that made him who he was, the only thing that justified all the pain and damage and cost. Maybe that's true. Maybe without the writing, there was no point. Or maybe he'd created a trap for himself, built his entire identity around being a writer, around being Papa Hemingway, until he couldn't see any other way to be, couldn't imagine a life that wasn't about the next book, the next sentence, the next attempt to capture truth on the page. Either way, the result was the same. A man who'd survived wars and plane crashes and every kind of physical danger finally couldn't survive the loss of his ability to do the one thing he valued most. You can read the books without knowing any of this. Millions of people have. They work on their own. The sentences are clean. The stories are powerful. The emotional impact is real, regardless of whether you know about Ernest's marriages or his drinking or his final years of paranoia and depression. But knowing the life adds something, makes the work more complex, more troubling, more human. You read A Farewell to Arms differently when you know it came from actual heartbreak. When you know Ernest really did fall in love with a nurse in a Milan hospital and really did get rejected when he came home. You read For Whom the Bell Tolls differently when you know Ernest actually went to Spain, actually covered the war, actually watched people die for a cause that was already lost, actually tried to make sense of violence and commitment and what it means to do the right thing even when it won't change anything. You read The Old Man and the Sea differently when you know Ernest wrote it at 51, already feeling old, already struggling with injuries and depression, already wondering if he had anything left. The old man fighting the marlin for 3 days, refusing to give up even when he knows the sharks will take it. That's Ernest, fighting to prove he could still write, still create, still matter. The work and the life are tangled together so completely that separating them would destroy both. We have the books because Ernest lived that particular life, made those particular choices, pursued authentic experience no matter what it cost. And the life makes sense, has meaning, has value, because it produced the books. Without the work, it's just a sad story about a talented man who drank too much and hurt people and couldn't handle getting old. Without the life, the books are still good, still powerful, but they lose something, some essential weight, some authority. Together, they create something larger than either one alone. A body of work that emerged from a real life, lived at full intensity, that captured something true about war and love and courage and loss, that changed how we write and how we think about writing. That's Ernest Hemingway's legacy, not the drinking or the marriages or the competitiveness or the cruelty, not even the Nobel Prize or the Pulitzer or the fame, the sentences, the stories, the books that will keep finding readers as long as people care about literature, and the example, for better and worse, of what it looks like when someone turns their entire life into material. When someone refuses to separate art from experience, when someone believes that truth matters more than comfort, that authentic experience matters more than safety, that the work justifies everything. Whether that's inspiration or warning depends on who you are and what you value. But it's worth understanding, worth sitting with, worth thinking about seriously instead of just accepting the myth of Papa Hemingway the way it's usually presented. The real man was more complicated than the legend, more brilliant and more damaged, more capable of greatness and more capable of cruelty, more human in all the ways that word actually means. He wrote the books, he paid the price. Both things are true, both things matter, and 60 years after his death, we're still trying to figure out what to make of that. Still trying to understand what it means, still reading the sentences he left behind and finding in them something worth keeping, something that matters, something true.